The interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project for the Library of Congress. The veteran's name is Larry A. Jackson. He was born on February 7, 1925. He served in the U.S. Air Corps during World War II in the European theater. He achieved the rank of first lieutenant. We are recording this on June 1st, 2013. I am Daniel Mack, and I am conducting the interview. No relation. Mr. Jackson, would you tell me about where you grew up and the time period?
I was born in 1925, as you noticed, in Florence, South Carolina, when it was a nice small town of 16,000, and I was either the fifth or sixth child of my parents, Arthur and Rosa Jackson. My father was a conductor on the Atlantic Coast Line Railroad, and parenthetically, I can say no one ever enjoyed his work more than he did. He had a good time, and it was a little bit reminiscent of pilots later on telling war stories. All those railroad men got on the front porch and told railroad stories. So I grew up listening to a lot of folklore about being a crew member on a train. So I grew up with the twin, and we were I believe I mentioned, the fifth and sixth children of my parents, and they were older when we were born. Mother was 40 and Dad was 55. And I was the firstborn of twins. I've been told that's important. The firstborn is stronger than this, and that's proved to be true, although he's still living and doing pretty well.
Well, tell me about what it was like in Florence, South Carolina during the 1930s.
Florence had a population of about 16,000, and it had no industry really, no textiles, although Darlington nearby did have a textile plant, but it was essentially supported by the Atlantic Coast Line Railroad, because all the crews between New York and Miami, that was change place for crews. So some of the local residents, their route was from Florence south and some north, and that was the main line of the Atlantic Coast Line, with fast passenger service in those days between New York and Miami, but also big freight yards, roundhouse where they repaired all the locomotives in the whole Atlantic Coast Line system. We had no other industry, really. That was odd. Darlington had some textile mills, but Florence did not.
And when you were getting out of high school, what was the state of the world, and what did you do after getting out of high school?
Well, I finished in 42, and as you know, the war started in 41. And almost my entire class, well, either that year or the following year, went into the service, all the males in the class. And in my case, I went to Warford for 1 year, and then I voluntarily joined the Air Force. But no merit involved, because I would have been drafted immediately anyway. And went to Gulfport, Mississippi with my best friend, John Whistlehunt, and both of us ended up navigators. In that period, they were needing navigators more than pilots. Both of us, of course, wanted to be a pilot. That was the natural assumption when you went in. And I was lucky because of they sent me to Colby College. I don't know if this was luck or not, but because I'd already had a year of college, we had a great CO, and he called 5 of us in and said, "We're not going to keep you guys here because you've already had a year of college. You've done everything we can possibly do for you. And if that hadn't happened to me, I never would have gotten in combat, because my friend who stayed at Colby College spent just about the rest of the war at Colby College." But I was glad, since I was going to be in, that I had the whole experience.
And I understand you got all A's on your navigational.
Well, that's
Yes.
only, did I tell you that? That's what it says here, unless I redid this later. Yeah, piloted, celestial, yeah, good. Well, I love navigation school, actually.
What did it consist of?
It consisted of going to class from 8 o'clock till 4 o'clock every day, and doing simulation missions, learning, had a electrometeorology every day, but mostly you did simulated missions. They would hand you a brief sheet, and they say you're taking off at 0800, reach altitude of 25,000 feet at X, and they gave you all the wind direction. And then you had to do a simulation mission on your map. And if you, that was good training, really. And it also tested your patience. The guy next to me was a wonderful guy from Tennessee, but on our 4-hour test every Saturday, about in the middle of it one day, he got up, tore his chart, said, "The hell with this, I'm going to the infantry." And that's what he did.
Do you remember his name by any chance, or just that he was
No,
from Tennessee?
I might have done that a few years ago, but I don't.
That's people from Tennessee for you.
There you go.
Now, from out of navigational school, what did you do from there? Were you assigned, then divided into your battalion, and from there assigned a plane?
No, we had to go through what was called transition, and we went to Avon Park, Florida, where we found our crew. We met our pilot, we met the whole crew there. And in the next month, maybe 2 months, we did missions over Florida, simulation missions, and getting practice in navigation, getting the crew to know each other. My pilot was oddly enough because of Hogan's Heroes. His name was Gilbert Hogan, and do you you ever see the movie Hogan's Heroes?
No, I didn't.
That's an 8th Air Force movie, but my pilot really was Mr. Hogan, but not the one the movie was made of. Actually, he was 28 years old and far too conservative to be a pilot. He was more concerned about getting home safe than he was. He didn't really like what he was doing. Well, none of us would have chosen him, but he was not a typical Air Force pilot. And in fact, after we flew and got to England and flew 19 missions, he was grounded because on the way to our target, 5 different times he made up a reason to go home. He would say, "Jackson, I've got to feather the right engine because it's overheating." I said, "Hogan, that's not overheating. And you can't." "Yes, Jackson, you're the navigator, I'm the pilot. Give me a heading home." And he did that 5 times, which probably saved my life, but he got grounded. And by the time I got on another crew, the war was over. So we flew 19 missions with him before he kind of blew up, really.
Now, tell me about getting assigned to the 8th Air Corps,
Yeah.
the 8th Army, and then getting from where you took off and then getting into England.
Yeah, it was the 8th Air Force, which was the big bombing group in England, and
What was the plane?
B-17. So when I was sent to Avon Park, Florida, and met the crew, the pilot, co-pilot, engineer, bombardier, navigator, and 5 gunners, a radio operator. And so we had anywhere from 9 to 11 members of the crew, depending. We had a ball turret gunner. Do you know the B-17 at all?
Yes.
Good airplane. And we met them in Savannah and got a brand new B-17, and we flew it to England. going through Bangor, Maine, and navigating across the North Atlantic. And it was a little bit awesome, but not so terrible because you had so much information from the planes ahead of you. There were so many planes going over that you had very accurate weather information.
And it was a non-stop flight from Newfoundland to England?
From Newfoundland to Wales, yeah.
Newfoundland to Wales. And once you arrived there, what was the, I guess, state of affairs at that time when you arrived in England?
That was in January of 45, so you see that was just about 5 months before the war ended. But they were really stepping up the bombing missions to Germany. You can work out the ethics of that if you like, whether we really needed to do that, because it was obvious that Germany was going to collapse as a military power. But we bombed them right up to, I think the end of the war was April, and the 1st of April we were still bombing Germany when it was quite obvious that, you know, the war was over. And
It doesn't help to leave tanks lying around.
but
It doesn't help to leave tanks lying around, so.
right. In my time, the casualty rate was not nearly as bad as it was, especially in 43 and 44. In 43, they had calculated that by the time you did your 35th mission, you had 0 chance of surviving. That was the way they had it worked out. But the casualty rate was much lower than that during my time.
And tell me what it was like, I guess, before, after, and during a mission, typically, and any specific missions you may remember.
Well, typically, well, one in the office. There's a good movie called 12 O'Clock High. If you can ever rent it, which you can, it's the most authentic movie. It captured the experience of the 8th Air Force perfectly. And in the officers club, if you were going to fly the next morning, right over the bar there was a red light which said, you'll be flying tomorrow, go home, go to bed. Or if it was a white light, they didn't know whether they were going to fly. It was still standby. And if it was a blue light, it meant, live it up, boys, there's no mission tomorrow. And in that movie, 12 O'Clock High, they have those, they redo that perfectly. You can imagine the joy that went up in the officers club when the blue light came on.
When would the blue light be turned on, or when would the lights, I guess?
We wouldn't know that until they would come from 8th Air Force headquarters. And I don't know all the calculations that went into whether they were going to fly the next day, but it had something to do with, mostly to do with weather, because very few days we did not go. I don't mean every crew went every day, but there was a mission almost every day.
What time would the lights usually be turned on, though? At what time would you know?
You never knew for sure. I was not a drinker, so it didn't bother me, but you really wanted your pilot not to get drunk the night before we flew, you know? And one night, one of the pilots was literally so drunk he could hardly stand up. And 2 of us went to see the commanding officer and asked if he'd be taken off the flight schedule for tomorrow. And he says, can't do that. Do that, everybody's going to be drunk tomorrow night. And so I said, well, what's going to happen to his crew? He said, well, he's got a co-pilot. Well, actually, that crew got lost. Not in combat, they got lost in southern France, way off course. That's a sad story. Some mother got a letter that your son was killed, bravely in combat, with actually the drunk pilot killed their son. Sad story. But that was rare.
Were all the members of your crew are officers, or was it you and the pilot as officers and the rest enlisted?
Pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, and navigator were officers. And everybody else, most of them by that time were sergeants. If they'd just gotten over as a replacement, they might be a PFC, but most of them were sergeants. Very good too, they were well trained. Had a radio operator who could also fill in for the navigator. At least he could get your location by radio if you had to.
Is there anyone else on your crew that you remember? Did you have the same crew for the same 19 missions?
Yeah, all of them. Well, I consider the most proficient man on our crew was the bombardier. He was all business. His name was Hector Gagnon. He was from Massachusetts. And he just, when you were with him, you knew it was all business. He was going to do what he needed to do. I rate my pilot as not a really first-class pilot. In fact, he got grounded later on, so my evaluation must have been pretty true. And we had a co-pilot whose main aim was to see how many women he could conquer in London on his leaves. That was his main interest in being in England. And he was not a serious guy at all. But the bombardier was serious, and the radio operator, who was a sergeant, was excellent. Everybody's a good crew member, except maybe the co-pilot. And the pilot was far too conservative. He was 28, and most pilots were between 22 and 24. I don't know how he got late in the whole thing, but he was very conservative, turned around 5 times on the way to the target. And he would call me up and say, "Jackson, give me a heading home." I said, "Hogan, we can't go home." "Jackson, I'm the pilot, give me a heading home." I said, "Well, why are we going home?" "Well, the right engine, the far right, is overheating." Well, wasn't true. And so he got grounded.
Did he have a new excuse every time?
Yeah, something was, he had to feather, he always feathered one engine. You know what feathering is? You turn the engine off and you turn the blades so they don't, the resistance is less. Well, we came home, all those turnarounds with feathered engines. But when they found nothing wrong with him, he got grounded. Probably saved my life, because after 19 missions and I got grounded, it took me a long time to get another crew. And by that time, the war was over, so I can't complain.
Did you keep an active record of, on the missions you did go, targets hit or anything of that nature?
Oh yeah. The navigator had the official log of the flight, and every member of the crew was alerted that if a plane got shot down, we would record the time and where we were. We were escorted by P-51s, but in those days they didn't have the auxiliary tanks, so they turned around most of the time before we got to the target, especially if the target was like Berlin, which was a long ride. Once we bombed outside of Prague, Czechoslovakia, to a munitions plant. So we were escorted by P-51s about 3/4 of the way to the target. And we called them our little friends. They would always call up and say, "Your little friends are leaving you now. Good luck."
From what you can remember, were there any runs where you lost any escorts or any particular planes, or there was a high loss rate for your crew or for your bombing wing?
The worst one was actually not too far before the war ended, and we were bombing Munich, Germany, in between the I point, which is when you get to the I point, the initial point, the bombardiers, the Norton bomb sight took over flying the plane. Really, you set it toward the target, and the worst mission I flew on that last period between the initial point and reaching the target, we lost 3 planes. And you're most vulnerable in because you cannot alter your altitude. The bombardier is working, and you just, that's it. You set your course and you can't deviate from it.
How many planes would you go out with at a time?
Our group, we had 3 squadrons of 12 each, and sometimes we had a special lead, so there would be 36 planes plus maybe 37. Every now and then the general would go with us, and we'd kind of crank, this is going to be a pretty easy mission, or he wouldn't have picked it out.
It would go in your squadron or your plane, or?
No, he'd go with he would fly his own plane, but he'd join one of the groups, and he often joined our group, so.
Did the gunners keep track of planes they hit, as far as?
Yeah, and also they tried to keep track of any plane that was hit, and record which gunners hit the plane.
Did they ever have any competition between each other?
Yeah, I suspect some of it was made up. Yeah.
Did they ever fight over any kills?
No, they didn't do that. Yeah. Everybody was so glad to get home. They weren't too competitive. One of the things people always find interesting, when we got off the plane and went for debriefing, first there was the chaplain, he would shake your hand. Then there was the Red Cross girls, 2 girls, and they were handing out either grape juice or whiskey, and little shots. A lot of men lingered a long time with those 2 girls.
I'm sure for multiple reasons.
But yeah, medical reasons.
Yeah.
I didn't drink at all, so I could give mine to one of the other guys.
Was there, before you were taking off, was it extremely quiet? Did different people have different routines they did?
Well, we went to briefing with everybody, all the gunners, the bombardier, navigator, pilot, radio operator, we all had one briefing together, and then we divided up. The navigators had a special briefing, and which included a lot of weather information, and the pilots had a special briefing, and then the other guys could loaf. Yeah.
Tell me about the B-17 journey. The payload, how far it could go.
B-17, have you ever seen a B-17? Beautiful plane and very stable. Hard to shoot it out of the air because it could take a lot of punishment and keep flying, and it could come home on 2 engines of their 4. You might lose altitude slowly, but you could get home. And it was a plane, everybody's prejudiced, I'm sure, about their own, but everybody in the crew had a good location. I went on a B-24 once. Have you ever been on a B-24? The navigator had a little desk right behind the pilot. He couldn't see out of the plane. And in the B-17, I was in the nose and had windows all around. And it was a good airplane for navigation and pilot.
And you had how many gunners?
There there were 11 of us on the crew, so there was pilot, co-pilot, engineer, radio operator, navigator, bombardier. That's 6, and then the rest of them were tail gunner, waist gunner. The bombardier was also the nose gunner.
As far as any particular missions, I know you said you had one where you lost a lot, but were there any other ones that stuck out for any other particular reasons?
Well, one good thing for me, I was there near the end of the war, and our casualty rates were much lower. They calculated that in the beginning of the war, in the bombing mission in '43, by the time you did 25 missions, on that 25th, statistically you had a 0 chance of coming home. But by my time, the casualty rates were very much lower. Sometimes we came home without losing a single plane. Not all the time, but sometimes.
And you mentioned before we started recording, you bombed France one time.
Yes, a submarine base in Bordeaux. And that was a nice mission because we were there and back in about 2 hours. So.
Did anybody actually manage to hit a dock submarine?
I never saw any pictures. I just hope we did. Yeah.
Where would you say, by the end of the war, was there much air-to-air resistance, or was it pretty at that time?
Well, happily, even by my beginning mission in January of '45, Germany had no gas. So if they sent their fighters up, they made one pass and they were gone because they couldn't linger around. They also had they had developed a jet fighter, what was it? You remember Dan, 262, I believe, and it was the first jet I ever saw, and boy, it was frightening to see that thing make a pass at you. But their fuel was so limited, the jet fighters came up, made one pass at the group, and then they had to go. They didn't have any more fuel. But if they'd have gotten that earlier, it was pretty awful to see that jet coming towards you.
Imagine it would have been impossible to hit. I imagine for your gunners, it would have been pretty hard.
Very hard to hit. Yeah. I had a machine gun over the navigator's desk, but you can imagine with the 2 engines on this side, and I'm here. If I couldn't go far that way, I'd hit the engines. In fact, the gun was blocked, so you couldn't do that. So I had a very limited arc and I remember the engineer who stood up behind the pilot said, "You got one, Jackson, you got one." And I said, "It wasn't me." Somebody got one, but I think it was from the other plane.
What caliber would you say was the gun you had control over?
What, 30, you remember, Dan? I think it's 30 caliber. Yeah.
As far as your living arrangements and while you were in England, is there anything off-duty you remember in particular?
Well, we were near a little town of Thetford, and on our base we had what was reputed to be the longest bar in England, and you could get anything in the world you wanted. But oddly, we all liked to go to the pub in the village because, you know, it was authentic England, and you could sit out on the grass and talk to some people, local people. And I remember those as very pleasant evenings, going out and sitting on the grass in front of the pub and having a nice cold beer. Well, not too cold. The British didn't have refrigeration. It was kind of lukewarm, but much better beer on the base. But it was fun to go to the local. We were discouraged from eating because of food shortage, but They didn't mind if we drank their beer.
And what was the, I guess, the general attitude in the locals towards Americans?
Only positive. I never ran into anything except positive. Well, they had this, they had a saying very prevalent. The Americans are overpaid, oversexed, and over here. But other than that, I think they liked us.
When did you finally end up leaving England?
Leaving, I flew over the Azores on July the 4th because the operator at the tower at the Azores Air Base was a British guy. And he said, "Oh, you're going to be home for the 4th of July. Have a jolly good time." And we flew from the Azores to Labrador and then down to Savannah.
Did you actually make it back to the United States on the 4th?
Yes, we did.
Didn't get hit by any fireworks or anything?
The main thing, we were met by American Red Cross ladies, and they were kind of shocked when we got off the plane. We brought some ground people home with us, and each one of us had a can of open pineapple that the cooks had brought, and we got off the plane eating this pineapple, and these blue ladies, or whatever they were called, came up and said, "We came out to tear you guys up. We haven't seen pineapple in years." I said, "Just wait a minute, lady, I'll go get you a can."
And was it shortly after that you were discharged from the Army?
Well, we all thought we were going to the South Pacific. And, we were scheduled to go to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, reassemble our crew, and fly to a new base in the Pacific. And they sent us home for a 30-day leave, and during those 30 days the war ended. So that was in May of '45. So very happy event.
And were you actually, did they call you back to the base to be discharged?
Oh yeah. Had to go back to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and hang around for, I think, a couple of months. And then they sent us to some area where we were from. I went to Savannah, Georgia. And then from Savannah, I went to a base in North Carolina and got my discharge.
What kind of experience did your brothers have?
Well, there was a wide age difference, although we had the same mother and father. My older brother, who graduated from Clemson, and he was an electrical engineer, and he lucked out. He went in as a lieutenant commander into the Navy, but he spent the whole war in Hawaii at a naval base, and he had a nice quiet time. My second brother, who was 15 years older than my twin and me, he spent 3 long years in the Philippines. He had the roughest experience health-wise of any of us, because he came home with not in great health, but he recovered. He lived a long life. And then my twin brother, he went into something called V12. It was, if another war comes along, be sure and get in that if it's still there. So he left Clemson as a freshman. They sent him to the University of South Carolina to finish his engineering degree. That took him 3 years. And then they sent him to midshipman school in Fort Schuyler, New York. And about the time he graduated as an ensign, the war ended. So he did it very well.
Well, that's good. They all got home safely at the least.
Yeah, we were lucky. We all got home. The worst experience was the brother that spent so long in the Philippines, but that was because of health and just miserable living conditions.
What did you do after the war?
Well, I'd only been to college for 1 year, so I went back to Wofford, got my degree.
Did you know you were going to go to Wofford the whole time that was your plan while you were overseas?
Yeah, it was. And I've thought about that a lot. Why, I could have gotten into almost anywhere that they were very good to World War II veterans. But I always planned to go back to Wofford, and I haven't been sorry. It was a good place. Went back, same professors I'd left. That's kind of weird. 3 years later, but a lot of my classmates came back at the same time.
What about your life in general, as far as jobs and?
Oh, I've been lucky. I've always enjoyed what I've done. I left Wofford and did 1 year at a Northwestern University at a theological school. And then I volunteered to go to Germany again to work with the American Friends Service Committee. That's a Quaker group, and all of their workers are volunteers. You just get subsistence. And I ran a library at the University of Munich, and I did that for 2 years and thoroughly enjoyed it. Then I came back and finished a theology degree at Union Theological in New York City, which I might mention to you is the finest theology school in the world. But Reinhold Niebuhr was there, Paul Tillich, if you do any reading in theology. The two top theologians of the world were on the faculty, so I hit a good place. They were also good human beings.
Did you stay in academia for the most of?
Yeah, I most of my time has been in academia. When I graduated, for 1 year, I worked. I taught math at a private school in Tarrytown, New York, and then we moved to South Carolina. And for 3 years, I was a minister for counseling at a large Methodist church. And then I went back and did some more graduate work and got a job as a chaplain at the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California. And that's where Barbara and I got married before we went out there. We had a happy time there. It was a good place.
And I understand you came back to Greenwood here to Landon University.
Right. Spent 19 years as president of Landon and enjoyed all of them. Landon was, it became state supported the day I got there. So it was in such a condition that when I came down to interview, I found Barbara sitting on the bench crying. She says, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I said, "Well, Barbara, you don't look at this place now. Look at what it might become." And I took her to the college, Francis Marion in Florence, and the College of Charleston. And she saw what state support could do to a place, and her morale went up. So.
Tell me about the difference between starting at Lander and when you finished.
Well, I was there at a very lucky time because when I got to Lander, the only thing there was that old tower building and a kind of a prefab gym, metal gym, which Finest Horn got some John Drummond to help him build. So the whole campus was built during my time, not because anything I did. It was just the state took it over, and we kept pressing our case that if we were now state supported, we had the right to have a good campus, and everything went in place, one building after another, till we had a really good campus.
And when did you retire as president from there?
92. From 73 to 92. I should have rounded out one more year and have 20 years. all enjoyable years. Had good people to work with.
And is there, I guess we're winding down towards the end here, as far as stories in the after fact, things like the Berlin Wall falling or the assassination of JFK, is there anything in any events like that stand out in particular in your mind?
Well, especially the assassination of JFK, we were in Chile, living in Chile, and I was principal of an American-founded school, and I was on a picnic with the senior class, and suddenly the word came that Kennedy had been assassinated. The whole city of Santiago went in mourning. It was interesting. All the men started wearing black bands, as they do in Latin America, on their shirts. And the students, we were out on a picnic, it was a senior class picnic, and they gathered around immediately and wanted to have us pray together. So, well, Kennedy was very well loved in Latin America. I think he was loved everywhere, but especially in Latin America.
Well, is there anything in particular you can say that the Army did for you as a person?
Well, I actually enjoyed every part of my experience in the Army. My first 3 months, they sent me to Colby College in Waterville, Maine, and it was the nicest place imaginable. And the cooks loved the fact that they now weren't cooking for regular students, they were cooking for Air Force guys, and they treated us royally. In fact, one afternoon, the commanding officer called 5 of us in and said, you boys have already had a year of college. We're not doing anything for you. You've had all these courses. We're going to send you on out so you can go to navigation school. And all of us said, but sir, this is so nice. Didn't do any good.
Well, is there anything else I guess you would have to say now that we're wrapping up in general about your service or anything since then?
I remember, I think I can sum it up like this. We had in our navigation school, which was a 4 months long, tough schooling, but we had a guy who had just come back from doing 50 missions from England to Germany, and we asked him one day, tell us about it, how was it? And he kind of summed up my summary here. He said, great experience to have behind you. I think you hit it well, don't you?
Well, I would like to thank you on behalf of Clemson University and the Library of Congress for doing this, and personal thank you for your service, and it's been a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you very much. You did it very well.